you'll remember Tracy Crouch produced the fan-led review a couple of years ago, and I checked this afternoon. There is a white paper that's been put out, and it's gone out to consultation in September. And the latest, as far as I know, we do have people who may know more inside knowledge than I have. The latest we have is paragraph 86 of the review, which says, as appropriate, we will engage with key stakeholders on the specific details and wording of the legislation. This legislation will then be brought forward when parliamentary time allows. So we don't know when it's coming, but we thought it would be interesting to know what our panel had to say about it. And the first person I wanted to ask is our in-house legal expert from Brighton, Albion. What's the club view, Lloyd? What's the in-house club view on the need for an independent regulator?
Well, I think the club would welcome, anything which furthers transparency or good governance generally. I think, obviously, we've had lots of engagement with DCMS, and I think the intentions are in the right place. But I think our fear is more about the unintended consequences of what government regulation of football might bring about. Football's been around for 150 years, and we're currently in a position where the Premier League is the best league in the world. The pyramid is admired around the world, and we have lots of supporters and fans around the world who love the game. We have, I think, in the white paper and acceptance as well, that this is the crown jewel of UK sport and actually of industry to a degree as well. So I think any changes that need to be made to it need to be made with care and deliberation. I think what our concern is that football is already regulated in lots of different ways. So we have regulatory obligations to the Premier League, to the FA, on a European basis to UEFA, a global basis to FIFA, and those are all interlinked. Things come down from FIFA all through into the relevant national regulations. But beyond that as well, we're regulated when we have commercial activity. So everything which applies to anyone else applies to us also. So ASA things. The FCA governs our sort of ticket program. We have also regulatory obligations with our local councils when it comes to safety and security of our operations, and of course we have audit rights and all those obligations that apply to any other company. So we're already regulated in quite a lot of different spaces. So our kind of what we really want to understand, and this is what we've been speaking to DCMS about, and to be completely clear, DCMS have been really interested to find out as well, is what are the gaps that's being tried to be filled here? Are we going to have a situation which results in overlaps, duplication of work? Because I'm not sure that really achieves the goals that the government has set out to remedy with the white paper. And I think we have to be really careful that what we end up doing doesn't result in an ossification of what we've got currently in place. We don't want to stop people who are already investing in football from wanting to do that more. We don't want to act as a sort of barrier to more people wanting to invest, whether that's commercial partners or new owners in our game. And to be clear again, I'm not suggesting that is anyone's intention at government, but our fear is that is where we might get to if we take a very heavy-handed approach to this. So I think our sort of watchword would be light touch. I think we want to understand exactly what the vices are that the government thinks that this review will address, and let's keep it proportionate and approach those specific problems rather than having something which really changes the landscape and the ecosystem that we've been working in, and which, from our perspective as a club, is working really well.
Right. So you've got FIFA, UEFA, EFL, PL, FA, and the local council on there. And along comes Tracy Couch, quite rightly, and some of the things she recommended, which will be agreed to, are obviously uncontroversial. There should be more involvement, more equality and diversity. But you don't want two people looking over your shoulder at the same time.
Well, I think until you kind of understand like what the regulatory obligations are in a football club, it's hard to understand like why we'd be doing those things potentially twice, because we have reporting obligations. I mean, one of the key tenets of the report and the white paper is to address sustainability of football clubs, which we can definitely get behind. And I think if you think about what clubs already have to submit in terms of the Premier League, to UEFA, and basically through their audits as well, there's a huge amount of financial information which is already being provided. So in order to address that sustainability point, given that DCMS and the government seem to suggest that the new regime would not be a zero failure regime, I'm struggling to understand a little bit what it is that we're trying to drive towards, which isn't already addressed. So that's kind of where we're coming from, really, is to understand, like, are we going to be duplicating things? What is it specifically that we're not doing already the government thinks we should be doing? And that's what we're trying to get to the bottom, and we've been speaking to DCMS about that.
And Dan, you obviously work a great deal in football, and you across other sports, but what's your view of the fan-led review from just outside the in-house perspective? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think, as Lloyd points out, there's obviously a good reason to welcome anything which helps strengthen regulation where there are gaps. I suppose what the fan-led review has done more than anything probably is created a kind of mandate for some additional regulations which might otherwise have met resistance from participants within the sport. So if you look at the white paper, for example, one of the three key objectives is protecting heritage assets, but it then does go on to acknowledge that quite a lot has already been achieved now since they engaged the fan-led review in doing that at various levels, FA level and other levels in English football regulation. So to an extent, it's already achieved quite a lot without bringing in an independent regulator. It's given us this platform and this clear public demand to introduce some regulations. Where I think, the current official line, the cross-party line, is that there will be an independent regulator. So if that's going to happen, I think, as Lloyd alludes to, there's a good reason to sort of look not so much at where you can take regulation away from existing bodies, but where support is needed. For example, a statutory body would obviously have powers that range well beyond what any private body could have. You mentioned the FCA. That's an extreme example, that the FCA can bring criminal prosecutions. Disclosure obligations when the FCA comes knocking are somewhat more frightening than when anyone else comes knocking. So there's definitely a way that statutory regulation could help enhance football regulation, but I think, again, it's not about having necessarily multiple regulators looking at the same thing so much as maybe trying to support the regulations that are in existence with a degree of kind of force and authority, and perhaps even resourcing and funding, which is absent or might be absent from current institutions for particular areas.
At least at one level, against all of those abbreviations I read off FIFA, having one body say that you should have a common test for a particular purpose from the outside looking in, does that seem like a good idea?
I guess it depends what the purpose is. One of the possible advantages, one of the, I think, interesting suggestions of the fan-led review is the club licensing model. And so kind of maybe getting away a little bit from broad stroke tests. The idea of the club licensing model to some extent is that each club can be regulated in a way that is appropriate to that club. So if you have a small club that is financially precarious, you can expect more stringent tests of profitability. Whereas if you have a club which is not really in any kind of financial danger, then you might allow them to pursue on-field success with slightly less of a weather eye on the bottom line. So I think if you're going to try and apply a very common test, that makes sense in terms of equality of regulation, but there is something to be said for accepting the different circumstances of clubs at different points in the pyramid and realising that, particularly when it comes to financial sustainability, which is the sort of key watchword of the review, accepting that all clubs are made differently and all clubs have different resources to fall back on. You can't necessarily regulate, a very elite Champions League club quite the same way you would regulate a club that is struggling to stay in the EFL, for example.
Yeah. And Sarah, you're working football when you look across from other sports. What do you see from outside of football, the position in other sports about calling in an independent regulator?
Yes, it's interesting what Dan says about the licensing model, because obviously we're in the absence of any draft legislation or proposals at the moment, but the response to the consultation suggests that it would be a licensing type, almost like a kind of off-gem model type regulator. The idea being that it would link financial matters more to local communities and supporters in a kind of over-regulated kind of relationship a little bit like you have with consumers, say in the energy markets and things like that. And of course, the background to all of this being financial overreach of people who purchase football clubs. We all know about the kind of very example where the whole thing just went completely under, and then basically a club that had existed for over 100 years was effectively no more. And then, you know, taking that idea, certainly there seems now to be perhaps not a retreat, but certainly a signalling, I think, from the latest consultation response that any regulation would need to be very tightly linked to any mandate which comes from perceived failure of the market. And I think at the moment, what the mandate seems to be limited to is this idea that there is potential for rogue owners, for want of a better expression, to purchase clubs and then to put them in a situation of financial overreach, and there to be nothing really that local communities or anything can do about that. Whether then, and again, it depends if we ever get any draft legislation, whether then that does give rise to the mission creep issues that have been spoken about, and the possible overlap and duplication of regulatory burden, it is a different question. But I mean, there's definitely an element of you wouldn't want to start from here about this whole process. I mean, there are other sports where the ownership issues and the commercial interests have arisen historically in different ways, and they do have a licensing model effectively for participation, and nobody has any problem with that. But football is different because of the way that football clubs are owned and structured and run. And there are smaller sports who are actively crying out for government intervention in regulation, because they're basically saying we can't afford to put in place all the investigatory and other regulatory framework and materials that are needed in order to actually uphold the standards that we'd like to adhere to. Again, that's not football's problem, because football is certainly at the upper echelons very well resourced. So I don't know. I mean, it's a bit of a kind of it depends answer, but I would hope that based on what the government is saying at the moment, that the regulatory provisions that they do produce in due course would be limited to those financial management issues and wouldn't necessarily stray too much into overlap with other matters which are already properly regulated. I mean, it's quite interesting that nobody's really talking about beefing up the fit and proper person test. Nobody's really getting into the moral or ethical dimension of who might own a football club. It's all very much focused on the financial management of it already. So maybe, just maybe, we're kind of worrying too much. I don't know.
Never a lack of worry for a lawyer. But back to you, Lloyd, if I may. One of the things Sarah mentioned is plainly a point of the corruption. I mean, the loss of Bury was tragic. It was the political impetus for the government to march and see that there were some voters in the nearby Bury area that wanted to go after Brighton. But community involvement in clubs. But Brighton from the outside looks as though it has a very, very big sort of local engagement, because both of its locale and also its history. How do you see the prospect of having sort of angry supporters on your board? I mean, is that an issue you want to confront?
It's difficult, because I suppose I'm more self-evidently speaking from a Brighton perspective, and there may be clubs which don't do things the same way. But from speaking from experience, we're very supporter engaged. We put on fans forums very regularly. Paul Barber will be there, Tony Bloom will be there. He'll get the train there, he'll sit in a pub with people, with about 13 people turning up, and talk to them and take their questions. And I think that probably speaks to where the club's come from and the journey that it's been on, which I guess is a wider point here, that football protected Brighton. 25 years ago, it almost went out of business, but it was the FA, it was the local supporters, it was the community around the football club which stopped it from going into oblivion. And whilst I don't mean to get the knife out, it wasn't government. Government wasn't anywhere to be seen at the time. We now find ourselves in a situation where we're a couple of hours away from the first European game the club's ever had in its history. And that all happened because Tony Bloom, a fan of the club, wanted to be involved. And I think, going back to my prior point, I think you have to be very careful at dissuading people like that from wanting to become involved. Back to your question more specifically, I don't think we've ever forgot where we've come from in that respect. I think we have had experiences. We've got a fan advisory board, which is effectively mandated now, and there have been some teething problems with that as well. But to me, it feels like an artificial way of doing things that football clubs should be doing anyway, which is speaking to the fans, having them involved, and that's just kind of a natural way that we do things. But maybe I'm just speaking from a sort of Brighton perspective in that respect.
Well, I think Bournemouth would have the same experience. You could still stand by the sort of club gate and watch the players arrive with those curious looking washbacks. I wouldn't know what's in the washbacks, but it's the internationally focused clubs that I think are going to be in for more of a shock. This isn't about me. So, next topic I'm going to move to is something about running of clubs. And there's been some change recently in the governing board exemptions that allows players who aren't born and bred domestically to come and play in domestic clubs. It's all very complicated for a little brain like me. Dan, what's happened?
Well, as an overview, I'm sure a lot of people here probably already know, but so the governing body endorsement system is how you get a visa to come and play professional sport. Here in England and Wales, or in the UK, in fact. So it's largely done, football has done it for a long time on a points-based system, which has attracted a lot more attention post-Brexit. Of course, as David was talking about earlier, movement within the EU was exempt from that points-based system until the end of the transition period. Very broadly, depending on what international appearances or how often you've played in leagues and where those leagues are banded for the purpose of the system, you might either automatically qualify for a visa, score enough points that you ultimately qualify through points, or you hit a level which it could be assessed on a discretionary basis, and essentially it's up to the FA to grant those endorsements which will allow you to get a visa. What's changing, so starting now, and then in the long term it'll sort of develop slightly how the system works. There's going to be this elite significant contribution system. Effectively what that is going to be is a sort of 4 slots, I suppose you'd say, in a team squad, up to 4, so anything from 0 to 4 that each team will be given. They will be allowed to then use those to essentially bring players in who have a much lower threshold. There's not no qualifying criteria, but the qualifying criteria is a lot more lenient to bring players over and get a visa for them. So you'll have less of sort of the issue of players, for example, being theoretically signed by a club, transfer fee is paid, but they don't necessarily come and play for them yet because they can't get the work permit, or you don't bother trying to bring players in from certain leagues because of that. And the system it's quite a canny idea in that you'll have anything from 0 to 4 slots, and that will depend on how many minutes you gave to English qualified players during the previous domestic season. So the more that you play homegrown players, the more that you therefore normally support the development of players. In England, the more opportunity you then have to, or the lower the barriers to you recruiting externally. Broadly, that is kind of how it works. So, I think
it sounds like it's perfectly simple. It's just really and easy to follow. And someone's got a clock measuring how long Johnny Smith, who uses a traditional English name, is playing in the last season. And he's going to stay on longer to get another foreign player in later in the next season. Is that the plan?
I mean, in a sense.
Perhaps I oversimplify, but that's how I come to understand. Lloyd, you have to actually struggle with this. So how do you see it? I mean, is this looking at something that's going to be easier or harder for you to operate?
Harder. I think having the 4, let's call it free hits that are now available to clubs has been generally quite well received by football clubs. Post Brexit, I think I read somewhere that the EU Schengen pool of players, which was previously available, was I think reduced from about 60,000 players to about 3,500. And I think overall the kind of pool of players worldwide is reduced by 90% post Brexit. So we're dealing with a world where we have to be quite creative in terms of where we look for our players, how we find them. And under the old rules, we had quite a lot of success because there was a limited exceptions panel which applied in respect of talented young football players. So we were able to bring in Buonanotte and Enciso and Alexis McAllister on that basis that they didn't meet the points criteria. But this was something that we could kind of do on an ongoing basis. And you did have an overall cap, but it was more so than the 4. I think the problem with the 4 is that your position as a football club can change quite a lot. And to be able to plan a pipeline into the future, which is what we try and do, is quite difficult when the number of players that you can have is based on what's happened in the prior season. So if you're trying to look 2 years into the future or 3 years into the future, but also bearing in mind how many you might have, or, how many slots you might have in the future, it's quite difficult. And if you look at Brentford, for instance, they would have counted on Ivan Toney being a guaranteed sort of player to get their sort of British player points up. But of course, then the betting thing happens and he's out the picture, and they're having to sort of backfill and work out that. So these things do happen in football, and so you get a long-term injury to, I don't know, say Solly March and Lewis Dunk, so it doesn't happen. You're in a very difficult situation, or a different situation anyway. So I think it's just the pipeline management of it, I think, becomes a bit more difficult.
There was no way of getting McAllister in because of some Scottish.
Fortunately not, exactly not. I fully understand where we are as a product of Brexit as something which sits outside of football. I understand that we're in a different world in respect of immigration to the one that we were in before, and football's dealing with that as it sees appropriate. And I think the general view within football is that this is better for clubs because it's giving them more opportunity to get players that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to. It just so happens that we were kind of using a means before that's now been effectively taken away, because there is still that application process for talented young players. But if you succeed, then they become one of your free hits. So it's kind of like you might as well just use one of your free hits, I suppose.
And Dan, it's not, I think you and I know, am I allowed to tell people that we work in the mint with the Hove, the polo every now and again? I look like a polo player, don't I?
Yeah.
Very much like a polo player, yeah. I mean, it is a problem in other sports, is that you've got this exemption of how you get players in, and it has to be a talent-based and talent-based focused problem. But you come across it across the sporting spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the GBE rules really is immigration law. That applies, it's governing body endorsement, not FA endorsement. That the FA happens to be the body for football, but it's really it's an issue for every sport, as you say. I mean, in some sports, it's much more of a minefield in terms of the rules are not as well structured, and the ability to assess, particularly small sports. You mentioned polo, but the smaller sports like that, particularly individual sports, how you demonstrate that someone is of an elite level when they're trying to come in. It's quite complicated. If you look at individual sports, it's sort of, for an individual player, in theory, it's a lot simpler because there are special exemptions if you're coming for a tournament, or if you're a boxer, you can get a temporary visa. You can come in, do your last bit of training, fight your bout, go home. It's pretty smooth. But when you're looking at sports where you're like trying to bring someone on a visa where they can live here, they'll be working here permanently for an indefinite period of time potentially. It's immensely complicated. I mean, every sport has to set it up, and many sports, like rugby, for example, have leaned towards this point system. I think, to be honest, there's definitely going to be teething problems with this new ESC system in football. As you say, I think all sports will deal with that because, as Lloyd alludes to, in the post-Brexit landscape, there's a lot of adjustment to be done to try and ensure parity in recruitment, particularly when you're thinking about, in football, Leyton Orient are not targeting the same players as Manchester City. If Manchester City's transfer target doesn't meet the auto pass criteria or get enough points, you would be quite surprised that they're targeting a lot of players like that. On the other hand, there has to be a system where clubs further down the pyramid can, through good analytics, through good scouting, benefit from their own experience without being prevented by the fact that there's no demonstrable proof that someone is going to make an elite contribution. So undoubtedly there will be teething problems, and that will be felt across all sports. I think every sport is still in a period of adaptation, post-withdrawal period, to try and find a balance between sensible compliance with modern immigration law and opening up the sort of modern elite sports person market in the way that we had 5 years ago.
Is Lloyd the sense that good for the government to change things from time to time, but a bit of stability for about 20 years would make everyone's life a bit easier?
Yeah, and I mean, in fairness, the government have recently come out and said that the Premier League, the FA and the EFL should meet on an annual basis to sort of address this and do what's best for football and the numbers to ensure that the game stays competitive. So let's hope that there is some sort of stability. And just going back one step, you made a very good point about targeting certain players, certain leagues. There is a knock-on effect of all of this, which is that a club like, I don't know, let's say that the top sort of banded leagues now, you can get players from those leagues, because the players who are playing in those leagues will typically meet the points criteria. But the leagues like the Swedish league or the Danish league or the Polish league are difficult to target now. And those were the sorts of leagues where you find your kind of hidden gems and sort of polish them up and turn them into first team players. They're difficult to find now because the points that they accrue for playing for those teams are so low that they're quite difficult to meet the points criteria. The knock-on effect of all of this is that effectively the cost of British players has gone through the roof. And the whole sort of desire behind this is to ensure that British players are sort of played and looked after. But it is also resulting in a bit of a trade deficit between England and the rest of Europe, in the sense that you have football players who can't go straight from Denmark to England, so go to Juventus first, and by that time they cost twice as much. And whilst we're all spending more money on our own British players as well. So it's all unintended consequences again, but it's all very interesting. We'll find a way through it.
Well, good luck. The next topic sort of comes in the same problem of how across Europe we deal with issues, is multi-club ownership. I'm not going to embarrass Lloyd by asking him anything about multi-club ownership. That's all. I'm not going to embarrass anyone. So I'm going to ask Danny. And the context in some ways is that Red Bull, with their mighty power in Austria, have become owners, investors, marketeers in two clubs, and to conceal their ownership, one's called RB Salzburg and the other's called RB Leipzig. They're doing it fairly upfront. What's the position at the moment in Europe, and how does it contrast on the rules on multi-club ownership?
Contrasts with domestic rules.
Domestic rules, yeah.
I mean, it's night and day, really, insofar as domestic rules are incredibly strict. You can really have no influence or interest in clubs that might be in the same league or league structure as you. So, for example, I mean, obviously there's exemptions for financial institutions, but without a kind of specific dispensation, even having loaned money to a club in the same league structure may prevent you from having any kind of similar interests in another or taking any kind of ownership stake. It's really very tightly regulated. There's sort of catch-all provisions to do with any influence whatsoever in the direction of clubs. So, on a domestic level, for understandable reasons, it's without express consent from, for example, the AFL, if that's where you're located, then it's really incredibly difficult to have a dual interest across the sort of European and international spectrum. It's very different. So FIFA's regulation essentially is that it's delegated downwards to its member federations and associations, and it's essentially the duty is just to ensure that there's no conflicts where it might affect the competitive integrity of matches. So essentially, if it's cross-continental, then you're broadly fine because you're not going to actually have competitive matches against those teams. And it's kind of UEFA where it's become a bit more of a flashpoint in recent years, the Red Bull being the sort of classic example of the sort of CFCB chamber decision. So how it works there is the test is decisive control, and that went to the CFCB probably, I think, 6 years ago now with the Red Bull case, which was interpreted to essentially mean that the same person or entity is able to direct decision making at more than one club. And obviously that, nominally speaking, then is quite a high bar to actually be able to direct the board or the football operations team how to act is a very significant level of influence. So anything below that, for example, it's just a financial investment, is broadly going to be fine. I think in practice, if you look at the Red Bull example, before it went to the CFCB, quite a lot of concessions were negotiated around the degree of influence that Red Bull would have over Salzburg and Leipzig, how the branding would mirror up, etc. So in practice, it isn't really a cut and dry. You put it in front of the CFCB and they say yes or no. It's really more of an iterative process around sort of setting fair parameters. And a lot of that really is to do with the fact that you have to be realistic about whether competitive integrity is really threatened. Try telling 11 elite professional football players that they need to throw this match, or sticking the youth team out there and pretending it was a tactical decision. It's actually incredibly difficult to do. So some of it is about just ensuring sort of fairness and perception from the fans is strong without having to really worry. In a lot of cases, you don't really have to worry realistically that one club is not going to compete fairly with the other.
But I mean, at some level, I don't want to be unnecessarily different, in my opinion, to you. But at some level, I get the point that 11 players are still going to run onto the pitch fired up with Red Bull on both sides. But then there might be a concern that the management of Leipzig are either not picking the strongest team or they're transferring players out. And it's at that level that it becomes more of a concern to the consumers across Europe.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there was actually, I mean, the Leipzig example was quite a good one, partly because they did end up meeting in quite a consequential group game. And I think they did not get, as I remember, they didn't get the convenient result there. I think everyone was worried they would play out a draw, and they didn't. So there was that advantage. But yeah, I mean, obviously, it's difficult. There's football regulates picking the strongest team at other levels as well. The EFL, for example, has rules at the sort of back end of the season to stop you getting teams throwing out the youth team because they've already earned promotion, when in fact it's absolutely vital to someone else's relegation interests, that match. So it's not new to try and monitor the strength of teams being picked. But in terms of the transfer cooperation, I think, that's certainly, it's one of the sort of perceived concerns. Definitely the Salzburg-Leipzig pattern was quite clear that there were a lot of players going through. That's not necessarily novel, though. I mean, I think it's obviously something that requires monitoring, but you've also got to remember that there's long-standing relationships that clubs have. I mean, you mentioned Jorge Mendes earlier. It's no great secret that Jorge Mendes' clients go to Wolves at an alarming clip. It's not new that there are relationships in football where people work more closely with one another. There is something to be said for the transparency of clubs like Leipzig, but I would also say you can't broad brush. You can't look at multi-club ownership as sort of one specific thing. There's very, very different models of it around Europe. So Red Bull and City Football Group are probably the extreme models where it's very upfront. With the cities, with City Group's New York and Australian teams, the kit is essentially the same. There's a whole kind of, they even talk about implementing the same style of play across their teams. In other areas, it's more of a sort of diversification of portfolio, and it's much subtler, and there's much less immediate collaboration. So I think to some extent, if there's a development to be had in the regulation, it's probably about trying to assess fact and degree and trying to separate out multi-club interests and multi-club ownership, which are two different things. So City Football Group is an example where it's common ownership. It just is clearly owned by the same group. That's not quite the same as somebody who is the majority owner of Club A and then holds a 15% interest in Italian Club B.
Yeah, I get that. Making it upfront helps. And Sarah, you work and operate in a sport where you can have a horse race with 7 horses running, 6 of whom are owned by the same yard or trained in the same yard in Ireland and owned by the same people.
Yeah.
And you know of team orders in that thrilling sport on Sunday afternoons of Formula One and Sunday mornings. What perspective do you bring to multi-party ownership?
Well, I think it is possible to over-focus on the ownership issues. Ultimately, the reason for the rules is to ensure the integrity of competition. And there are various ways in which regulators can ensure that individuals who are participating do always try their hardest. And actually, ultimately, there's a responsibility that lies predominantly with those individuals, be they people selecting teams or players or people managing. And so in a funny way, I think it's slightly odd to focus on who actually owns the assets in the club and to focus on that perception. I mean, if one looks at the racing example, I mean, it's not uncommon, for the racing in Newmarket for there to be several competitors from the Godolphin stables, and that race will be run very competitively, and it is completely and thoroughly checked by the stewards to make sure that the betting is proper and fair, and that the race is run and every horse is run on its merits. My own view is that, the sport then does very well in upholding the integrity of that, and there are not question marks around that just because there might be several entrants in the field that have come from the same stables or and the same trainer. So it can be managed, and I think you've got to look at it in lots of different ways. I mean, certainly without hoping to be too controversial, I mean, from the footballing perspective, I think there are issues around integrity that are not really focused on that could be. I mean, we've mentioned Ivan Toney already with the betting and things like that, but it does seem that there are more immediate issues about integrity and competitiveness in football than multi-club ownership, it seems to me. And so I can see why there is a perception from it, but in the end, are the betting public terribly worried about who owns all the shares in which particular football club, and do they share an academy, and do they have transfers into the same agents' work? I'm not so sure that is as important as the perception of actually what goes on the field.
Some of that, and who am I to argue with you? But in horse racing, you obviously know who the owners are because everyone's going around with the same colour.
Yeah.
And in some jurisdictions, over in Mauritius, not Mauritius, no, it is Mauritius, yeah, these are there, Port Louis. They require the jockeys to give their instructions before they start the race to the steward so that everyone knows what the instructions are. You've then got Formula One and some other motorsport where you've got Red Bull and then in disguise Toro Rosso. And even within the teams, you've got one rider, or they're called drivers, one driver being told to pull over for the other. That in a sense becomes the risk, doesn't it? That there is a control as to the outcome of sport if the same people own too much of that sport.
Well, I mean, obviously in F1, I mean, they describe it as a team sport, don't they? So, I mean, it's inherent within the system that not all the drivers are competing absolutely in the same way. And I think everybody who watches it knows that that's the way that it operates. So it isn't the same as a horse race. I mean, transparency is obviously a big part of it. I just slightly wonder if there's a bit of kind of sleight of hand going on with the focus in football on ownership of clubs, that it detracts a little bit from some of the real integrity and competitive issues. That's all.
Yeah, no, I mean, last time I watched Formula One was a long time ago because I didn't have a television anymore, but I listened to it on the wireless, and the team speaking to the drivers on the wireless is quite exciting, isn't it? So you know what's going on. So you could bring in the sort of same openness, communication in football as to who's doing what.
I'm sure you want to do that in real time.
I believe you can watch it on your computer now, Louis. So, yeah, I don't think you need to own a TV.
I'll buy one of those. When electricity reaches Dorset, enjoy the street lighting. Right, okay, brilliant. So that's multi-club ownership. We're going to move on to Rule K and disciplinary bodies. So there are two sort of things about Rule K. Rule K is the most magnificent thing because it points me every now and again to be an arbitrator. I like being an arbitrator. I'm very friendly, using the rates, that sort of thing. And it's also interesting to do them, particularly if you have been an arbitrator, because you can see how other people do. And it's a private system with panels pointed through the FA, sometimes three, sometimes one, more the merrier, sometimes, and on your own, sometimes two. But how does it work? Lloyd, you have to engage with Rule K. How do you find it?
I think Rule K is a really beneficial dispute resolution mechanism for the sport of football. I think the fact that you've got the kind of confidentiality angle, the fact that there's no issue fees, the fact that it's not as complicated as a sort of court process, I think helps, because typically you'll be dealing with disputes which aren't, there will be exceptions, but typically they're not that complicated. It might be an argument around whether someone's failed to pay someone else. And that doesn't I think that that's probably better dealt with in a situation like a Rule K arbitration than through the court process, which is more sophisticated, more costly, and more complicated. I think the changes to the sort of litigation process, certainly since I started as a trainee, have changed dramatically. And I think that probably for the kind of participants that you deal with in sport, Rule K is a good thing to have. I think there are probably a few things around the edges that could be tweaked in terms of process and transparency, perhaps from time to time, but broadly, I say I'm supportive of it.
And Dan, upsides and benefits of Rule K from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lloyd's touched on the main ones. Obviously, I think the lack of issue fee and the sort of relative simplicity of doing it is definitely really important when you compare it with, if you look at the alternative as being the court process, then, I mean, for a start, you think, you know, £200,000 of football is not that much money. That could easily be going around the lower leagues, but if you get to that level of claim in a court, then you're looking at a £10,000 issue fee. You also can't force anyone to answer it until you put in your particulars of claims. Then you've got to brief the solicitors and a barrister, you know, that costs an awful lot of money. With Rule K, you can do a quick.
I think I heard a reasonable amount.
Sorry, yes, that costs a very reasonable amount of money, but you know, cash flow is very tight, particularly down the pyramid.
CFAs,
and so you have this issue where there's a lot of admin and a lot of costs to go to what might be not actually even a disputed debt. I mean, not just in football. If you do any kind of commercial litigation, you realise that there are lots of people out there who, if they don't really want to pay, will just simply wait to see if you'll go away or actually do anything about it. In the court system, that often works, because do people want to stump up 25 grand and go through the court process? The answer is often no, especially if the debt is not itself that big. So I think, yeah, there's definitely that advantage, and obviously the relative speed as against the court system is huge. You know, if you use the Rule K standard timetable, then you should have had the hearing within 6 months of issuing, unless you have a massive dispute about trying to pick the arbitrator. You should do it within about 6 months. It's incredibly hard to get any kind of meaningful dispute resolved in the courts within 6 months. So there is all of that. I think where it might develop is, you mentioned sort of, you know, when it's just about someone not having paid money and it becomes a kind of debt collection process. Something beneficial might be that even 6 months is quite slow if you're really just talking about a very simple debt. But there is, I don't know if you've seen the Law Commission report on the Arbitration Act, there is sort of a move now towards trying to empower arbitrators to make summary judgments, which currently they're a little afraid to do, because you know, if you go in front of arbitral panels, often they'll grant a lot of extensions, etc. The court would never countenance, because they don't quite have the level of authority, and they're very afraid of somebody challenging the fair process. Somebody used the line "due process paranoia" to me about this before, which I thought was very good. But you know, those reforms could, I think, really be advantageous to the Rule K system, because there is sometimes a way you can kind of drag these things out when they're in fact very simple. And if that came in, it would just strengthen it even further as a kind of efficient mechanism.
Yeah, right. You've got to set somewhere. I mean, the great thing I think about is that, you know, when you sit as a judge and you come into court and someone puts a pile of papers on your desk, you wish that you'd had a chance 6 months before to speak to the parties to say, why don't you just sort this bit out of it? You know, and in Rule K, you can do that. You get emails from the parties and they sort of say, well, can we have 7 days because we're talking? And you say, yeah, fine. As long as things are moving along, everyone's happy. I mean, the problems come in disclosure, but enough from me. Sarah, what do you think about Rule K and other sports wide regulation?
It's funny that you mentioned disclosure. The problems do come with disclosure. Yeah. I think there's a massive tension between the kind of let's do it light and quick and easy, keep it all commercial and moving along, and then on the other hand, the disclosure, because quite often you'll have one party kind of saying nothing to see here, let's just get it all resolved, and the other side saying no, we need to trawl through all the emails and the documents and all the rest of it. And so and certainly then what can happen is you get things outside the arbitral process, like kind of data subject access requests being used as a kind of backdoor disclosure route and things like that. So it's not a panacea. I mean, certainly for straight up and down commercial things, it seems to me that Rule K is extremely fit for purpose. I suppose some of the issues come in around cases which are a little bit on the borderline for being under Rule K anyway, and also the fact that you've got perhaps sometimes quite participants don't have any real choice about Rule K. I mean, basically, if you're a participant, that's it, you're automatically signed up to it, and the Arbitration Act rules apply. I know I've had cases which involve young players who were minors at the time when they signed up and all the rest of it. There are issues around that, it seems to me, in terms of how genuine the agreement is for them to have participated in that. There are also situations where people are on the periphery of the definition of participant, which have obviously troubled the courts a few times as well, although it's fair to say the courts are very keen to keep Rule K alive and kicking. So all those challenges have met with pretty short shrift. So I think for what it does, it's great, but it's not a kind of one-stop shop for all kind of sports regulatory disputes. And you obviously then need to kind of design a process for other things that need more transparency and greater public perception of justice being done, as well as the parties being able to resolve a dispute in a quick way. That's a total lawyer's answer, isn't it? I'm really sorry.
That's what you get paid what you do. Right, okay. Well, our last topic is we're rapidly running out of time. We could do one of two, so I'm going to choose because I'm in charge. We're going to do women's soccer, and we're going to talk a little bit about Spanish practices. My pet hate, and it is a proper pet hate, I do not. As I sit at home in Dorset, I wind up my wireless and I listen on a Saturday. I get 8 hours of men's football, followed by Doc Savage talking about men's football. And then Dan Rowan comes on and says, well, the Women's World Cup's fantastic. And then everyone says it's fantastic. And then, well, it finished, that's it. We won't talk about it. Now we just talk about Spanish football. How, though, at club level, how are the Seagulls dealing with women's football? They've got a team. What are the growth and prospects? How do you address, within your role, the women's team?
That's a good question. I think
I got there eventually.
I think my sort of approach since I've come into the club in terms of purely legal process has been to say there should be no difference between the process that we have on the men's side as we do on the women's. There are differences in the regulatory framework, and there are challenges in the sense that typically you're not always dealing with people who are quite as experienced as maybe some of the people we do on the men's side, which is not to criticise them, it's just more nascent. But I do think that I've seen a real change in that side. This summer in particular, we, as a football club, I think it was definitely the window which I felt was closest to that I've seen in terms of the practices on the men's side. You know, agents were much more engaged. The transfer fees and salaries were much higher than they have been in the past. We signed players from Brazil, from Germany, from Australia, from England, and there were lots of loans. We dealt with Manchester United and Chelsea. It just felt like the market was much more what I'm used to seeing on the men's side, and that's not meant in any sort of negative sense, but it was more that I'd noticed this kind of change of direction. But in answer to the question of how do I treat it, I mean, I don't see that there should be any difference between how you treat it from a legal perspective. You might have other clubs which don't have sophisticated legal functions. You might have agents who don't have lawyers on hand, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't treat it with the same level of detail. And of course, you've got the same agents regulations which apply in the same sort of way. So, yeah, that's my answer to that question, really.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I wouldn't discriminate between the female player and the male player. I mean, the commercial opportunities, both for the players and their sponsorship rights and the like, seem to be going through the roof. And that may be connected to the growth of difficulties in the attraction of the agents. Sarah, I've heard from Chris Sutton and Savage at length about the Spanish incident. Is there anything you'd like to say about what happened in Spain?
Well, I think it's a textbook example of how not to handle a situation, but I think we probably all agree on that. In terms of how sports deal with those kind of situations and that the kind of culture that reveals, I think it said a lot to me that there's still a lot of work to be done. That every time you think you've won a battle in terms of equality, then you can't be complacent because you might need to go out and win it again. And it did speak to me a lot about how you can turn something that's really good into something really very disappointing. My daughter is 12 and she's watched, I know you say you didn't, she watched every minute of the Women's World Cup. She's absolutely adored it. And to be honest, my son watched a lot of it as well. And I think it's a real generational shift that the kids are very happy to watch the football if it's the women playing, if it's the men playing. They don't really distinguish in the same way that somebody from my generation would have. And she was so crushed when that happened at the end. And she just said, that's such a shame. And she'd been supporting England all the way through, obviously. And she just said to me, she said, it's such a shame for the Spanish because they played really well and it should be their greatest moment and it's completely spoiled it. And that for me I think is why it's really important in everything that I do, and when we're doing work on the judicial panel and everything, that we make sure that we don't do that. We don't crush women's sport, and we don't crush their success with that kind of behaviour. So, yeah, sorry, moral lecture over, but
No,
that's what I took.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think, Dan, 2 minutes. What can we learn, do you think, from the, can I call it the Spanish problem? Spanish, what can we learn from the Spanish problem?
I think, so from a purely regulatory perspective, I suppose the thing that I thought was very interesting about this is it's quite a good indication of the extent to which on-the-field success can influence how you develop regulation, the importance of trying to accept and proactively address problems that get raised. And particularly what I'm thinking of is, obviously before the team went to the World Cup, the Spanish team, there were 15 players wanted to sit out and protesting. I don't know who watched the game, but you'll notice that I can't speak for how the Spanish press covered it, etc. But the commentary when Spain won, before the Rubiales incident, was very much, the tone was very much, Jorge Vilda has been vindicated. They were right, the RFEF were right. They've kind of won over these recalcitrant players and they've won the World Cup. And it was very much kind of, look how good the team is. We must be doing everything correctly. The Rubiales incident completely shifted that narrative before they'd even got off the field. And now people are saying, oh, in fact, these restructuring complaints, these concerns that people have raised, perhaps we do need to address them. I think it's interesting. It's almost a sliding doors moment. It shouldn't take, a criminally charged sexual assault to get you to address complaints that players within the sport are making. But I do personally, I think that had that incident not happened, the momentum would have been entirely with the RFEF and Vilda, or Vida, sorry. And I think that it's pretty unlikely that those players would have been able to drive forward the reforms they have. And I think it's just a great reminder. There's a good analogy really with UK sport at the moment and the sort of athletics and gymnastics push about what they're calling winning well, and trying to focus more on, in that instance, it's to do with mental welfare and trying to not let the lust for gold medals at the Olympics cloud your judgment on how far you're pushing someone, on how you treat young athletes. It's a similar thing. I think that sometimes on-field success can give you the impression that there are not problems, or the problems are minor, you don't have to address them. And I think it's a really interesting sort of sliding doors moment to look at and think, had that not happened, would any of this have been addressed? How long would it have taken for there to be any structural changes? So I think that's kind of interesting. It's a reminder of the importance of regulating proactively, even when things are rosy, and particularly an important lesson for English women's football, because obviously our team is currently very, very good. That doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing to address.
No, I understand. There was claiming there was a problem in Spain before the tournament kicked off, which just surfaced in that tragic way. Right, it's an end of us. But breaking into your beer time, does anyone have any questions? Come on, wait, off you go.
So I think each of you have spoken in kind of different contexts about transparency, and especially interested in Lloyd's view on this, but talking about a multi kind of club ownership structure, and then moving towards related parties transactions, especially in sponsorship, and then kind of heightened scrutiny and sponsorship arrangements, with obviously gambling companies being banned from 2026, I think it is, and a lot of in the last year kind of crypto companies sponsoring clubs. How are you seeing the kind of heightened scrutiny from your perspective on a commercial level? Kind of one, how are you diligencing or selecting your partners? And then second kind of element to the question, are you seeing a more targeted approach when you're looking at commercial partners for women's football, rather than the kind of folding in any sponsor that you get from the men's team and saying, we'll sponsor the women's as well?
So taking your first question, due diligence is something that you always have to take seriously, because the number of occasions that we've seen it go wrong, you just have to ensure that you're certain what you're dealing with. And even with the best will in the world, clubs get that wrong from time to time. So we will take that seriously when we're dealing with partners. But I think generally speaking, we are relatively risk averse as a football club. So we haven't got a crypto partner. We haven't done NFTs. And although there's been central deals done at Premier League level, our general view was nothing against the sector. we just don't know it. We don't understand it. We aren't crypto specialists. And so before we go and push that out to our supporters, we want to understand it a bit more first. And if it's still a viable income stream in a couple of years' time, once we've been able to understand it, then we will explore it. So that's kind of the approach we take into a lot of those things. Obviously, betting, as you said, is changing as well. We partnered with Betway, who we've kind of satisfied ourselves that on the market there, on the most sort of the players with kind of most integrity. So that's the kind of a general approach we take to things. But I think on the associated party transactions and fair market value, I think you have to welcome that as a sort of development within the regulatory sphere of football, because there is a concern that money is disguised as commercial revenue when in fact it's just owner injections. And I think to have that Premier League kind of process there in place, I think is really valuable. I think it's still relatively new, so we're still, I guess, working out certain things. Does that fall within the ambit of this? We've had conversations over the last couple of years about whether, for example, a stadium's utilities bill would need to go in for like approval, and we've worked through that with the Premier League. But I think broadly and generally, it's definitely something which needs to be welcomed from a transparency perspective. I would say that Brighton is at a bit of a juncture in terms of its rise, which has been quite quick, relatively speaking, since it's got to the Premier League. And commercially, I think there's still quite a lot of room for growth there. And so we're not, I wouldn't say at the moment, probably in as quite a sophisticated space as being able to choose and have women's only side partners. I would really hope that we could get to that position soon, but we're not there yet. When I was at Arsenal, we'd started doing that, and I worked on a deal with MasterCard, which was, I think, the first arrangement which we had, which was women's side only. And I saw the other day that there was a new sponsor which Arsenal had announced as being, selling. So they're obviously moving that in that world, and I'm, fully supportive of doing that to the extent that you can as an organisation.
Sure, thanks.
Right. Could you be so kind as to thank this magnificent panel for giving up their time and expertise to you?